A tail longer than the ROV that found it curled at the joint the instant the claw lifted it clear of a brine pool on the Gulf floor, and fossils don't bend. Miles Hartwell had piloted recovery claws for 6 years without ever once second-guessing a grip. He second-guessed this one twice before he trusted the readout telling him the sample was still fully intact. It shouldn't have been intact. Not at that size, not after however long it had been sitting in sediment this deep. Miles eased the claw back a few inches, just enough to get the whole shape into frame, and the tail flexed again on its own weight, the way something still holding moisture flexes and nothing mineral ever does. Miles didn't call out over the communication line. He walked straight to the wet lab instead and knocked twice on the doorframe, hard enough that Dr. Corbin Ash looked up before Miles said a single word about what the claw's grip sensors were reporting. Corbin didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he asked Miles to zoom in on the cut edge, the place where the tail had clearly been separated from the rest of the animal. The tissue there still glistened. That glisten is the reason Halcyon Marine Biosciences suspended this entire research contract inside a single week, and it's the reason Miles is finally willing to say what actually happened aboard that ship before the story got flattened into a funding dispute. Corbin ran a gloved hand along the recovered section without touching the exposed tissue directly, close enough to confirm what his eyes had already told him. The cartilage inside still held its shape under light pressure, the kind of structural integrity that vanishes early in fossilization, long before anything else about a specimen changes. Fossilized cartilage crumbles. This didn't crumble. Miles asked the obvious question, the one neither of them wanted to answer yet. How long does something have to sit in a brine pool before it looks like this? Corbin's answer wasn't reassuring, and it wasn't a real answer either. He said it depended entirely on the pool, and this particular basin had never been properly studied long enough for anyone to know. Brine pools like this one sit at the bottom of the ordinary ocean without ever mixing into it, dense enough that debris settling onto the surface sometimes just floats there instead of sinking through. Almost nothing that falls in decomposes the normal way, because almost nothing down there has enough oxygen left to do the job. That's an environment built to keep a secret, not solve one. Halcyon's own survey maps listed that brine pool as an unremarkable hypersaline feature, flagged once, years earlier, and never revisited. Nobody aboard that ship had signed on expecting to overturn an extinction date. Halcyon Marine Biosciences was funding the crews to bioprospect the basin's microbial life for pharmaceutical compounds, the unglamorous, patent-driven work that pays for most deep-sea research nobody outside the field ever hears about. A recovered megafauna specimen wasn't part of anyone's budget line. Miles has piloted for 3 different research operators over the past decade, and Corbin was the one who vouched for him after an equipment failure on an earlier ship nearly ended his career before it started. Nobody else would hire him that season. Corbin did, without asking Miles to explain himself twice. That earlier equipment failure wasn't even Miles's fault. Not that it mattered much at the time. A senior pilot on that same vessel had signed off on a maintenance log Miles never actually saw, and when the claw arm failed mid-recovery, it was Miles's name on the operating shift, not the signatures. Corbin was the only person on the review board who asked to see the maintenance log itself before voting. Nobody else had bothered. Miles has never forgotten that debt. He just never expected the chance to repay it to look like this. He tagged the sample, logged the coordinates, and queued a basic tissue panel before anyone off the ship even knew the recovery had happened. Corbin's first isotope reading came back within the hour. He read it twice before he said anything out loud. Neither of them realized yet that queuing that analysis had done something else entirely. The ship's satellite uplink logged the request the moment it ran, and unscheduled data transfer routed automatically to whatever system onshore was tracking the cruise's bandwidth. Somebody was apparently watching that traffic in real time. What do you do with a result that tells you an animal supposedly extinct for millions of years died sometime in the last several years instead? He didn't announce it to the whole crew. He told Miles first in the wet lab with the door shut. The collagen hadn't fully degraded. Radiocarbon adjacent isotope ratios pointed toward a death recent enough to measure in years, not eons. Whatever this tail belonged to, it hadn't been dead anywhere near as long as the fossil record says the species has been gone. Corbin hadn't even finished drafting the incident report that standard procedure required. Bertram Cole, Halcyon's compliance liaison for the cruise, radioed the ship directly within the hour. Before a single word of that report had left the vessel, nobody aboard had ever seen a response that fast for anything short of a safety incident. Cole didn't ask what the tissue panel had shown. He told Corbin evenly that unverified biological claims risked jeopardizing the consortium's entire bioprospecting license for that basin. Corbin said the isotope data spoke for itself. Cole didn't engage with the science at all. He simply asked a second time whether Corbin planned to submit the finding formally, in a tone that made clear only one answer would end that particular conversation. Cole explained the stakes without much cushioning. A basin suspected of hosting a living apex predator, especially one connected to a supposedly extinct species, invites exactly the kind of environmental review that can freeze a bioprospecting permit for years, while regulators sort out habitat protections nobody had budgeted for. Halcyon had 3 more years of exclusive sampling rights riding on that basin staying quiet. Corbin pushed back once, asking whether Halcyon intended to fund independent verification instead of simply burying the result. Cole's answer was that Corbin's entire multi-year grant relationship with the consortium was, in his words, currently under internal review. Under review was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. Miles listened to that whole exchange from just outside the wet lab door, near enough to catch every word and far enough to stay officially out of the conversation. He said since that the part that actually frightened him wasn't Cole's threat. It was watching Corbin, a man who'd never once backed down from a funding dispute in 11 years, go quiet in the middle of one. Miles stayed late that same night going through the ship's old mission archive, the kind of tedious cross-referencing nobody schedules a pilot for, the sort of task that only gets finished by someone who can't stop turning a detail over in his head. Buried 3 folders deep, he found a redacted survey summary from a Halcyon-funded cruise to that same basin, 6 years earlier. The redactions covered almost everything except one line: recovered specimen, cause of preservation undetermined, sample destroyed per consortium protocol. Destroyed per consortium protocol wasn't standard language for a microbial sampling report. Miles checked the crew manifest attached to that old survey out of pure reflex, half expecting to recognize a name. He didn't. Whoever had stood in Corbin's position 6 years earlier had already left the field entirely, according to the one public record Miles could still find with their name attached to it. This wasn't the first time. Somebody at Halcyon had stood exactly where Corbin was standing now, at least once before, and made the same tissue disappear. Picture finding that sentence at midnight, alone in a ship's records room, and realizing the decision about to be made above your head has already been made once before, quietly, by someone whose name isn't even on the page anymore. Miles didn't sleep that night. He photographed the redacted page with his own phone before returning the folder to its shelf, in case anyone thought to check whether it had been opened. Somebody did check, 2 days later. Nobody ever told him what the ship's system logs actually showed. Cole arrived aboard by helicopter the following morning, along with a company technician who requested immediate custody of the sample, the isotope data, and every recording made in the wet lab since the recovery. Corbin didn't hand it over immediately. He asked first whether Halcyon intended to preserve the sample for future study, or simply remove it from the record the way the previous one apparently had been. Cole didn't answer that question directly. He said the sample would be handled according to consortium protocol, the exact phrase from the redacted report, spoken with no apparent awareness of how familiar it already sounded to the 2 men standing across from him. Corbin's hands weren't steady handing over the sample case. Miles noticed and said nothing because there was nothing left to say that would have changed what was happening. The tail went into a sealed transport container within the hour. The original tissue panel data followed it onto Cole's own drive, wiped from the ship's local system before the helicopter even lifted off. Cole's technician worked through the wet lab methodically, checking drawers and backup drives Corbin hadn't even thought to hide anything in. He never once opened the personal laptop sitting closed on the counter, 3 feet from where he stood. Some things get missed simply because nobody imagines the obvious place is worth checking. Miles had already done one thing Cole's technician never checked for. Before the wipe, he'd compressed the raw isotope readout into a single file small enough to push over the ship's satellite uplink, and sent it to his own personal account during the 20 minutes Cole spent arguing with Corbin in the wet lab doorway. It's the only surviving copy of that data that didn't come from Halcyon's own server. 3 days after the seizure, the ship's sonar operator flagged a contact near the brine pool's edge on a routine sweep, large enough that the system logged it automatically instead of waiting for a human call. It held position for nearly 2 minutes before drifting past the edge of the array's range and vanishing from the display entirely. Nobody has ever confirmed what that contact was. Corbin has never claimed to know either, and he's said publicly that he won't pretend certainty he doesn't have just to make the story land harder than the evidence supports. What he will say is that something large enough to register on a system built for shipping traffic doesn't belong. Drifting past an unremarkable hypersaline feature that supposedly holds nothing worth a second survey. The sonar operator who logged that contact has since transferred to a different Halcyon vessel entirely, a routine reassignment according to the paperwork. He hasn't spoken publicly about what he saw on his own screen that afternoon, and nobody aboard the original ship expects him to anytime soon. Silence on that particular consortium has always paid better than the alternative. Let's be honest about what the fossil record actually says, because pretending otherwise helps nobody. Every serious extinction estimate for this species relies on the youngest confirmed fossil anyone has ever pulled from the ground, and that consensus rests on real evidence nobody credible disputes outright. What that consensus can't account for is a stretch of seafloor almost nobody has ever properly sampled. Brine pools like this one sit in some of the most inhospitable water on the planet, oxygen-starved and dense enough to slow decomposition to a crawl, and fewer than a handful worldwide have ever been surveyed closely enough to know what settles at their edges over time. An extinction date is only as good as the last place anyone actually looked. Halcyon's public statement, issued 2 weeks later, described the recovered material as a contaminated sample compromised during onboard handling, and made no mention of the isotope panel, the sonar contact, or the redacted report Miles found in the archive. Nobody at Halcyon has explained why a contaminated sample required a same-morning helicopter recovery and a full data wipe. Corbin's funding relationship with the consortium was not renewed at the end of the current grant cycle, a decision Halcyon attributed to program consolidation unrelated to any specific finding. He'd run projects through that funding line for 11 years. The letter notifying him ran 4 short paragraphs, thanked him for his contributions, and never once used the word tail, brine, or basin anywhere in the text. He didn't fight the decision publicly. He didn't need to, not once Miles handed him a copy of the isotope file that Halcyon's own wipe had missed. Corbin has said the moment that file landed back in his hands mattered more to him than any grant renewal ever had. It meant the 11 years hadn't just quietly evaporated into somebody else's redacted paragraph the way the last researchers apparently had. That file is the reason Corbin is still working, now through an independent research foundation with no consortium ties at all, and the reason he says he isn't bitter about losing 11 years of funding over one afternoon in a wet lab. He says the funding was never really the thing he was protecting. Miles has stayed on with Corbin at the new foundation, at a fraction of his old salary, doing the same unglamorous piloting work he's always done. He's never framed it as a sacrifice. He says he's just finally getting to finish repaying a debt he assumed for years he'd never get the chance to. The new foundation runs on a fraction of Halcyon's old budget, and neither man has any illusions about how long that arrangement can last on its own. What it doesn't run on is anyone else's permission to decide which findings are worth keeping. Corbin has started keeping his own field notes in duplicate now, 1 copy on the Foundation's server and 1 on a personal drive he checks weekly, a habit Miles has never had to explain the reason for. Corbin keeps a single printed page from that isotope file taped inside his office door, not because a case number ever attached itself to it, but because it's the only physical proof left that the 11 years before this one actually happened the way he remembers them. He's stopped waiting on Halcyon, or anyone else with a letterhead, to confirm what's written on that page. He says the only opinion he was ever really trying to protect was his own, and Miles's, and neither of them needed a consortium's permission to trust what came up out of that claw. The brine pool itself has never been resurveyed. Halcyon's current map still lists it as unremarkable, the same word from years before Miles ever pulled a tail out of it that shouldn't have still been able to bend. Miles has asked Corbin more than once whether they'll ever get funding steady enough to go back and look properly. Corbin's answer is always the same, eventually when it's their decision to make instead of somebody else's to bury. Until then, the printed page stays taped to the door, and the redacted line from 6 years earlier stays folded inside the same file. A reminder that whoever came before them never got that choice at all. If your own work ever handed you proof that something above your pay grade would rather bury than believe, tell us about it in the comments below, because Miles spent one long night in a ship's archive deciding an old debt to a friend mattered more than a contract either of them could afford to lose. And if you want more accounts brought up from the deep, subscribe. Because whatever left that basin still hasn't been accounted for, and this channel isn't finished asking who else already knew.